Welcome to this session of Literary Criticism, where we will be looking into the essay Tradition and the Individual Talent. Tradition and the Individual Talent was originally published in two parts of The Egoist in 1919. In 1920, the essay was included in T.S. Eliot's full-length book of essays on poetry and criticism, The Sacred Wood: Essays on Poetry and Criticism. The essay highlights Eliot's critical principles related to his notion of tradition and delineates the importance of the sense of history in writing and understanding poetry. Eliot argues that poetry should be impersonal, which means that poetry should be independent of the personality of the poet. The essay is divided into three parts. In the first part, Eliot explains his idea of tradition. The second part deals with Eliot's theory of the impersonality of poetry, and the third part sums up his critical assessment. Let's move on to part 1 of the essay, where Eliot talks about his notion of tradition. Eliot begins the essay by pointing out that the word tradition is not acceptable to the English because it may not carry the idea of being original. The English praise poets for the works that are individual and original. The true mark of a poet lies in his originality. This importance on individuality shows that the English praise poets for the wrong reasons. Eliot does not agree with the English because he feels that the best and the most individual parts of a poet's work would reflect the influence of the writers of the past. In Eliot's own words, I quote, "If we approach a poet without his prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously." Unquote. Let's try to find out what exactly Eliot means by this. Eliot considers tradition to be of immense significance. Tradition is not a blind adherence to the ways of the previous generations. Tradition is neither a slavish imitation nor a mere repetition of what has already been achieved. Originality and novelty are better than repetition. Passive repetition is to be discouraged. For Eliot, tradition is a matter of immense importance. Tradition cannot be inherited. It can only be obtained by hard labor. This labor is the effort taken to know the past writers. It is the effort taken to separate the good from the bad and to know what is good and useful. Tradition can be obtained only by those who have historical sense. What does Eliot mean by historical sense? According to Eliot, historical sense involves a perception, I quote, "not only the pastness of the past, but also of its presence." One who has the historical sense feels that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer down to his own day, including the literature of his own country, forms one continuous literary tradition. Unquote. Eliot realizes that the past is found in the present, and the past and the present form one continuous order. This historical sense is the sense of the timeless and the temporal. It is this historic sense which makes a writer traditional. All this being said, let us find out what Eliot has to say about a writer and his sense of tradition. A writer with the sense of tradition becomes conscious of his generation and identifies his place among the writers of the present age. He is conscious of his relationship with the writers of the past. A sense of tradition suggests that there is a recognition of the continuity of literature. The sense of tradition instills the belief that the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present. The knowledge of these significant writers could be obtained through constant practice. Tradition is the wisdom and experience that is necessary for achievement. A writer's worth cannot be assessed in isolation. The value of a poet or an artist can be judged only if his work is compared and contrasted with the works of the poets and artists of the past. Such comparisons and contrasts made would frame a better impression of the significance of the work of a new writer. Tradition constantly changes, grows, and influences other works in different ways. It is neither fixed nor static but dynamic. A writer in the present must seek the help from the past and conform to literary tradition because the past guides the present and in turn the present modifies and alters the past. Regarding the assessment of a work of art, Eliot mentions that when a new work of art that is created is new and original, literary tradition is modified, though slightly. The relationship between the past and present is reciprocal. The past directs the present, and in the process it gets modified and altered by the present. Every great poet like Virgil, Dante or Shakespeare adds something to literary tradition out of which future poetry would be written. The work of a poet in the present is to be compared and judged by the works and standards of the past. This judgment does not mean that the present work is better or worse than the works of the past. It is not possible to judge an author in the present by employing the principles and standards of the past. The comparison or contrast made is to comprehend the facts about the new work of art. The comparison is made for framing a better understanding of the new. This comparison is mutual. The past helps to understand the present and informs about the past. In this way, an idea of what is really individual and original can be framed. By comparison and contrast, it is possible to separate the traditional from the individual elements in a given work of art. We move on to the sense of tradition according to Eliot. The sense of tradition does not suggest that the poet should know only a few poets who he admires. Such a decision would be a sign of immaturity and inexperience. A poet should not be content with knowledge of a particular age or the period he favors. This may be pleasant and delightful, but it would not encompass a sense of tradition. To know tradition, the poet must judge critically and confine himself to the main trends so that he could exclude all that is inconsiderable. He must realize that the main literary trends are not determined by the notable poets alone. Ordinary poets too are significant and they cannot be ignored. We move on to the works of art and the significance down the ages as elaborated by Eliot. Eliot is of the opinion that art never improves, though the material remains the same. The mind of Europe may change, but this change does not mean that distinguished writers like Shakespeare and Homer become obsolete and insignificant. Great works of art never lose their significance because there cannot be a qualitative improvement in art. There may be refinement and development from the perspective of the artist, but there cannot be improvement. For instance, it would be improper to comment that the art of Shakespeare is superior to that of Eliot. This is because their works are of different kinds and the materials on which they work are different. According to Eliot, acquiring knowledge does not mean merely bookish knowledge, but the capacity to acquire knowledge from several experiences. The capacity to acquire knowledge differs from one person to the other. Some can absorb knowledge easily, while others must work hard. Shakespeare could gather more knowledge about Roman history from Plutarch than most men could from the British Museum. It is the duty of every poet to acquire the knowledge of the past, and he must continue to acquire this consciousness throughout his vocation. Such awareness of tradition inculcates an honest poetic sensibility which is essential for poetic creation. We move on to Eliot's impersonality of poetry, considered to be highly significant. Eliot believes that the artist must continually surrender to literary tradition which is more valuable than his individuality. He must allow his poetic sensibility to be molded and modified by the past, which would enable him to acquire the sense of tradition. During the formative years of the artist, his self or his individuality may assert itself. But as his powers mature, there must be a greater extinction of personality. He must acquire greater objectivity. His emotions and passions must be depersonalized. He must be as impersonal and objective as a scientist. His sense of tradition is more important than his personality. A good poem is a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. The artist must forget his personal joys and sorrows and be absorbed in acquiring a sense of tradition and expressing it in his poetry. The poet's personality is a medium like a catalytic agent or a receptacle in which chemical reactions take place. This is the reason why Eliot mentions that true criticism and sensitive appreciation do not depend on the poet but upon poetry. In the second part of the essay, Eliot further develops his theory of impersonality of poetry. He compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst and the process of poetic creation to the process of a chemical reaction. Just as chemical reactions take place in the presence of a catalyst, the poet's mind functions as the catalytic agent for combining different emotions into something new. To explain this further, he tells us about an experiment. Suppose there is a jar containing oxygen and another jar having sulfur dioxide. Now the two gases combine to form sulfurous acid only when a fine filament of platinum is introduced into the jar. The combination takes place only in the presence of the piece of platinum which acts as a catalyst and hastens the reaction though the metal itself does not undergo any change. It remains unaffected during the chemical reaction. The mind of the poet is similar to the catalytic agent. It is necessary for the combination of emotions and experiences to take place, but it itself does not undergo any change during the process of poetic combination. Eliot uses the analogy. Let's explain the analogy with the help of the chemical reaction that is explained here. Sulfur dioxide and oxygen are the reactants. These two reactants react with each other only in the presence of platinum catalyst, and under conditions of pressure you get the product, which is sulfurous acid. However, the product sulfurous acid does not contain the trace of platinum. Similar to this reaction, we find a reaction taking place in the mind of the poet according to T.S. Eliot. Here again we have the feelings and the emotions. The feelings and the emotions are the reactants that combine together in the mind of the poet, and due to the intensity of artistic process you get the final product, and this final product does not bear the trace of the poet's personality. The mind of the poet is constantly engaged in forming emotions and experiences and creating them into new wholes, but the combination does not contain even a trace of the poet's mind, just as a newly formed acid does not contain any trace of platinum. However, a young and mature poet may include his personal emotions and experiences, and the expression of his mind may be found in his composition. Eliot says that the test of maturity of an artist is the completeness with which his mind digests and transmutes the passions which form the substance of his poetry. To quote Eliot, the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. Unquote. The man suffers his experiences, but it is his mind which transforms the experiences into something new and different. The personality of the poet does not find expression in his poetry. The experiences which enter the poetic process are of two types: emotions and feelings. Poetry may be composed out of emotions or feelings or out of both. Eliot distinguishes between emotions and feelings, but he does not state the differences between them. The distinction should therefore be ignored, though it has influenced his impersonal theory of poetry. If all this is true, then what actually goes on in the mind of the poet? Eliot compares the poet's mind to a jar or receptacle in which innumerable feelings and emotions are stored, and they continue to remain there in an irregular form until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound can come together. Poetry is organization rather than inspiration. The greatness of a poem does not depend upon the greatness or even the intensity of the emotions, but upon the intensity of the process of poetic composition. Just as a chemical reaction takes place under pressure, so also intensity is needed for the fusion of emotions. The more intense the poetic process, the greater the poem. Eliot elaborates about artistic emotion and personal emotion. He says that there is a difference between artistic emotion and personal emotion of the poet. As an example, he gives us quotes from Keats' Ode to a Nightingale that contains a number of emotions which have nothing to do with the nightingale. Eliot mentions that, I quote him, "the difference between art and the event is always absolute," unquote. The poet has no personality to express because he is merely a medium where impressions and experience combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for man may find no place in his poetry, and those which become important in poetry may have no significance for man. Eliot thus rejects romantic subjectivism. The emotion of poetry is different from personal emotions of the poet. His personal emotions may be simple or crude, but the emotion of his poetry could be complex and refined. It is the mistaken notion that the poet must express new emotions that results in much eccentricity in poetry. It is not the business of the poet to find new emotions. He may express only ordinary emotions, but he must impart a new significance and meaning to the emotions expressed. It is not necessary that they should be his personal emotions. Emotions which the poet has never personally experienced can serve the purpose of poetry. Let's look into what Eliot has to say about Wordsworth's theory of poetry. Eliot rejects Wordsworth's theory of poetry that claimed to have its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility. He points out that in the process of poetic composition, emotion, recollection or tranquility are not found. In the poetic process, there is only concentration of experience, and a new thing results from this concentration. The process of concentration is neither conscious nor deliberate, it is a passive one. The elements in the poetic process are conscious and deliberate. A bad poet is conscious where he should be unconscious, and unconscious where he should be conscious. It is this consciousness of the wrong kind which makes a poem personal, whereas mature art is impersonal. Eliot does not mention when a poet should be conscious and not. The point remains indistinct. We move to the concluding part of the essay, whereby he says that, I quote, "Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality," unquote. Eliot does not deny personality or emotions to the poet, but asserts that the poet must depersonalize his emotions. There should be an extinction of his personality. This impersonality can be achieved only when the poet surrenders himself completely to the work of art. The poet can know what is to be done only when he acquires a sense of tradition. Historic sense makes the poet conscious not only of the present, but also of the present moment of the past, not only what is dead, but of what is already alive. Let's summarize what we have done so far. The essay brings in two cardinal aspects of Eliot's critical pronouncements: tradition and impersonality in art and poetry. Eliot establishes his views on the relation between tradition and the individual talent. Eliot frames the parameters required to assess the worth of an artist. The idea of tradition is not restricted to its conventional sense. To possess tradition, the sense of history is important. The artist must surrender to tradition to bring out the best in him. Impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways to form new wholes that do not contain the personality of the poet. The mind of the poet is like a catalyst that allows the formation of a new product that does not bear the stamp of the poet. Poetry is different from the personal identity of the poet. All this being said, we have a couple of questions for you to answer that would help you understand what T.S. Eliot meant by talking about history, individual talent and historical sense. Until we meet next time, thank you.